So very early on, when you have Christians having these conversations, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's unanimous agreement about those. Particularly, and that's not to say that there aren't other Gospels that pop up. It's that you have this chain of custody that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. Jesus has disciples, and there's a group of individuals who we call the Apostolic Fathers, who are the disciples of Jesus' disciples. And so they comment on the books that the disciples of Jesus, or that people within the community of the disciples of Jesus wrote. And so we actually have a very close connection to the time. And we see early on that you have guys like Ignatius of Antioch arguing that there are only four Gospels. He's in the 2nd century, and there couldn't be any more than four. Or Theophilus of Antioch makes the similar argument, and they name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Ignatius of Antioch also talks about other Gospels, but he specifically highlights the fact that the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of, these ones that we kind of hear about, Mary, Judas, that the reason we know that they're not associated with the names that are attached to them is because they're being written in times when those people were dead, and they have these rings of pagan philosophy that are incorporated into them, which is completely foreign to 1st century Judaism. So Jesus would not have, so in the Gospel of James, Jesus is worshiping a goddess named Sophia. It's like, okay, well, no 1st century Jew is going to do that. That's obviously paganism. And so we have these early conversations. But when Christians are thinking about, well, what is and isn't Scripture, the earliest Christians are Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And the Jews had this idea that the promises of God are followed up by the writings, the documents that establish those. So the word is often used as covenant, right? God makes a covenant with people, and that's always followed up by written text. So this is why sometimes, well, in the case of Moses, it's literally inscribed on a tablet, right? And in the prophets, sometimes you get this command, write this on a scroll and inscribe this on a tablet. And that the Jewish scriptures in Jesus' day were seen as a story in search of a conclusion, because they were looking for this figure, this Mashiach, the Messiah, who would come and fulfill things like the reign of David. So they're talking about these things. They're actually expecting them to happen. And so the story in search of a conclusion in the Christian understanding is that Jesus is that individual. He comes and he does things like he says at the Last Supper right before his crucifixion, that he's establishing a new covenant in his blood. And so the earliest Christians, mostly who are Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, they see, okay, there's a new covenant, which is actually promised in Jeremiah 31:31, when God says that he's going to make a new covenant and inscribe the law in people's hearts. That covenant has come. Okay, the promises have come. So the earliest Christians very organically say, okay, where's the writing? Because we expect this to happen. Promises are followed up by writings. And so they start to have these conversations of what are the writings and where can we find them? And so very early on, because the New Testament has 27 books in it, very early on, 24 of the 27 are unanimously accepted. So by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, we have lists in documents like there's a document called the Muratorian Fragment, which there's debate on its dating, but it's probably like mid to late 2nd century, and it includes 24 of the 27. And it gives reasoning why. Now, the other books that are in our New Testament that aren't in that 24 are ones that were discussed because the earliest Christians were trying to figure out, okay, can we tie this to either an apostle or someone who knew an apostle? Because we have a lot of books flying around with the names of John and Peter on them. So you have the Acts of Peter, and you have the Revelation of Peter, and you have the Gospels of Peter, and so how do we do our due diligence to try to tie this back? So there's 2 letters of Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter in the New Testament. And the early Christians are like, we got to make sure we can tie these to Peter. Or the book of Jude and the book of James, which are ascribed to the brothers of Jesus. They were like, can we really say that those are written by those people? And so there are some books that the dust kind of takes time to settle on within the whole 27 canon, because these groups are debating and discussing, well, why do we have these ones and not other ones?
Right.
And so there are various canon lists that come up throughout the ancient world where some people are hypothesizing, well, maybe, this book is part of it, or maybe this book is part of it. But it's this ongoing conversation of people, and by basically the end of the 2nd century, we have more or less unanimous agreement of the 27 books being those that encapsulate Scripture that can be tied to either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus.